The Harrington Grand Ballroom. 800 candles. 300 guests in couture. Crystal chandeliers throwing gold light across a room full of people who believed that wealth and power were the same thing. Armani Carter stood at the top of the entrance stairs and let herself take one long, slow breath. Her emerald gown caught the chandelier light, simple, stunning, chosen deliberately. Not to impress anyone. To remind herself that she had earned the right to stand anywhere she wanted. Even here. Especially here. Across the ballroom, Sterling Hayes was already holding court. Champagne glass raised. Tuxedo perfect. That slicked-back blonde hair gleaming under the lights. His new fiancée glittered on his arm like a trophy he had spent months polishing for exactly this room. Investors laughed at everything he said. Of course they did. Sterling had always known how to perform genius without actually possessing it. He had no idea Armani was here. He had no idea that the Korean financier who had quietly acquired 40% of his company 6 months ago had spent those 6 months doing exactly one thing, verifying who had actually built the investment model his entire empire was standing on. He had no idea that the same financier had walked through the east entrance 11 minutes ago. And he had no idea that man was currently moving through the crowd, moving toward her. He absolutely had no idea that in approximately 8 minutes, someone was going to ask him to explain, live, in front of every board member, investor, and journalist in that room, exactly how his revolutionary financial prediction system worked. This was going to be unforgettable. 3 years ago, Armani had left Sterling's company with a box of her belongings, a bruised reputation, and a settlement his attorneys had described as generous. What they had not noticed. Buried in Section 11, subsection C, written in language so precise it could only have been crafted by someone who wanted it missed, was a single clause. Contingent equity. 15% activated the moment any liquidity event exceeded the threshold. Sterling's lawyer had skimmed it. The company was barely surviving back then. 15% of nothing was still nothing. They had signed without a second look. Armani had walked out, gone quiet, and waited. Now she stood in the ballroom, watching Sterling gesture at financial charts he clearly did not understand, and she felt nothing but calm. A deep, steady calm. The kind that only belongs to a person who knows exactly what is about to happen. Across the room, Sterling finally noticed her. His smile did not falter. It sharpened. He nudged the investor beside him, tilted his head in Armani's direction, and laughed, loud enough to carry across the room. Look who showed up alone, he said to the crowd. My ex-girlfriend. She used to think she was the brains of the operation. The cluster of investors chuckled. A few glanced at Armani with the polite, dismissive curiosity reserved for people who don't belong. Armani did not look away. She did not smile. She simply held her ground, the way a woman holds ground when she knows the room is about to reorganize itself around her. Then the sound shifted. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a change in the air. The way a room full of powerful people goes instinctively, collectively quiet when someone enters their space and something deep in their instinct says, "Pay attention, Taejoon Park walked across the ballroom floor like the room had been built for him to cross it. Black suit. No tie. Dark hair neatly set above a face that had never, in his entire life, revealed a single thing he did not choose to reveal. The kind of man who never raised his voice because he had never needed to. Subtle ink traced along his wrist, just visible at the cuff. His subordinates, stationed at 3 separate points around the room, had already gone completely still. He walked directly to Armani. He stopped beside her. And without a single word, without looking at Sterling, without acknowledging the crowd, without any performance at all, he reached down and quietly took her hand. The laughter stopped. Because everyone in that ballroom knew exactly who Taejoon Park was. And everyone understood, in the same instant, that the woman they had just watched being mocked was standing beside the most quietly dangerous man in the room. Sterling's champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. Taejoon finally turned and looked at him. Not with anger. Not with threat. With the kind of calm that is somehow worse than both. Sterling, he said quietly. I have been meaning to ask you something. Your investment model, the one the entire company is built on. Walk me through how it works. The room held its breath. Sterling straightened. His polished, practiced smile came up like a reflex. He opened his mouth. And the trap, the one that had been 3 years in the making, quietly closed around him. He built his empire on her brilliance. Now he has to explain it. In front of everyone, Drop a gemstone in the comments if you are here for Armani's moment. Because Sterling is about to try explaining a system he has never once understood, and it is going to be glorious. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment telling me where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Blackheart. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor and Armani stepped out into the marble lobby of the Harrington Grand, where a woman in white gloves checked names against a leather-bound guest list and string music floated up from somewhere below like smoke. Armani gave her name once, quietly, and watched the woman's pen find it without hesitation. She had been invited. That had taken 3 weeks of careful maneuvering and one favor she had not wanted to call in. But she was here, and that was the only thing that mattered now. She rode the private elevator down to the ballroom level alone. The doors opened and the night opened with them. The Harrington Grand Ballroom was exactly the kind of room designed to make a person feel small. Ceilings 4 stories high. Chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls of light. Round tables draped in ivory linen, each set with enough crystal and silverware to outfit a small restaurant. Everywhere she looked. Old money moving through new spaces, people who had inherited power shaking hands with people who had bought it. Armani stood at the top of the entrance stairs and breathed. She had worn the emerald gown because it was the one thing she owned that cost nothing to look expensive. Clean lines. Deep color. It made her brown skin glow like something lit from within. Her natural curls were pinned at the crown, soft at the edges, deliberate without trying. She wore one ring. No necklace. She had learned long ago that a woman who enters a room without armor is the most dangerous kind. She descended the stairs slowly, not because she was nervous, but because she had decided before arriving that she would not rush a single moment of this night. She took a glass of champagne from a passing tray, touched it to her lips, and began to move through the room. She heard him before she saw him. That laugh. Broad and bright and performed for maximum radius, designed to pull every nearby ear toward its source. Sterling Hayes had always laughed like a man auditioning for the role of someone important, and 3 years had not changed that. He was standing near the center of the ballroom, anchoring a circle of 6 investors with the ease of a man who had never once doubted his right to be at the center of any room. The tuxedo was new. Everything about Sterling was always new. His blonde hair was slicked back to a high shine and his fiancée, tall, fair, wearing something backless and pale gold, stood just close enough to him to signal possession. The investors were nodding. Of course they were. Sterling was telling the story of his company's growth. Armani could tell by the shape of it even from across the room, the pauses, the gestures toward imaginary charts, the modest shrug before the impressive number. She knew that story by heart. She had written the chapter he was currently reciting. She moved to the far side of the room and stationed herself near one of the tall cocktail tables, her back toward the windows, the full ballroom visible in front of her. She was not hiding. She simply wanted to see the whole room before the room saw her. She did not have long to wait. Sterling's eyes swept the crowd the way they always did, checking attendance, assessing status, cataloging anyone who might be useful. She watched the sweep slow. Pause. Return. Land on her. The shift in his expression was almost imperceptible. Almost. She saw the half-second of genuine surprise before the performance reassembled itself. Then came the smile, wide, easy, designed to look like warmth but sharp underneath where it counted. He said something to the man beside him. Tilted his chin in her direction. The investor turned to look. Then another one. Then Sterling's voice came up just enough to carry. "Look who finally showed up," he said to the circle, loud enough for the 3 tables nearest to him to hear. "My ex-girlfriend. She used to think she was the brains of the operation." The circle laughed. One of the investors turned to get a proper look at her with the careless curiosity of someone inspecting an anecdote. Sterling's fiancée pressed her lips together in the precise shape of second-hand embarrassment, which was its own kind of cruelty. A few heads at the nearest tables turned. Armani stood still. She held her champagne glass at the same height. She did not drop her eyes. She did not tighten her jaw. She had rehearsed this moment, not with plans or words, but with something quieter. She had rehearsed what it felt like to be looked at like that and to feel nothing shift inside her. She had practiced stillness the way other people practiced arguments. Sterling watched her for one more second, waiting for the flinch. It did not come. He turned back to his circle, already moving on to the next performance, confident that he had landed the joke and the woman in green had absorbed it and that was the end of it. He had made this miscalculation before. It was the same one he had made 3 years ago when he thought she would simply disappear. On the other side of the ballroom, near the arched windows that looked out over the city skyline, a man stood alone and watched. He had been watching for the past 20 minutes. Not conspicuously, not with any visible focus. He held nothing in his hands. He had refused every passing tray. He simply stood with the particular stillness of a person who does not need props to occupy a room, dark eyes moving with unhurried precision across the crowd. He had noted Sterling Hayes within 4 minutes of arriving. He had noted the fiancé, the circle of investors, the shape of the performance. He had been waiting for Armani Carter. He recognized her from the photograph, but photographs had not captured the posture, the way she carried herself through a room full of people who had underestimated her without seeming to calculate it at all. That was not performance. That was something built over years of being dismissed in rooms that needed her more than they knew. When Sterling's laugh rolled across the ballroom and the circle turned to look at her, the man near the windows watched Armani's stillness with the careful attention of someone confirming a conclusion he had already reached. He had spent 6 months and a considerable amount of resources investigating Sterling Hayes's company. The algorithm that anchored the entire firm. The predictive model that had drawn institutional investors, closed 3 major funding rounds, and formed the basis of a valuation that had made Sterling Hayes a wealthy and celebrated man, had not come from Sterling Hayes. Every technical document told the same story. Every version history, every development log, every buried annotation in the original code pointed to one author. The woman in the emerald gown standing alone by the cocktail table, holding her champagne glass steady while the room laughed. He had known he would come to this gala. He had known she would too. He had known this moment would arrive, and he had decided weeks ago exactly what he would do when it did. He set down the glass of water a passing server had pressed into his hand and began to move. Armani was watching a couple near the dance floor and thinking about nothing in particular. The specific blankness she had learned to keep on her face when her mind was working hardest, when she became aware of a change in the room's texture. It was not a sound. It was the absence of sound moving toward her like a slow wave. She had heard whole concert halls go quiet in less than a second when a conductor raised a baton. This was subtler and somehow larger. The conversations nearest to her did not stop. They simply lost their momentum, trailing off mid-sentence as attention was pulled elsewhere. She turned. A tall Korean man in a black suit was crossing the ballroom floor toward her. He moved without urgency and without hesitation, which was its own kind of speed. The crowd parted without him asking. Not from fear, exactly, from the same instinct that makes people step aside for something they sense is inevitable. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Sterling, who had gone rigid at the far end of the room. He did not look anywhere but directly, quietly, at her. He stopped in front of her. Up close, she could see the clean lines of his face, the ink that traced along his wrist just below the shirt cuff, the dark eyes that held something she had not seen directed at her in a very long time. Certainty. Not arrogance. Not performance. Just the steady, unmistakable certainty of a person who knows exactly what they are doing and why. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask permission. He reached down and gently, without any hesitation at all, took her hand. The ballroom did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way a fire goes out, first the edges, then the center, until the whole room was holding one shared breath. At the nearest tables, conversations stopped mid-word. Champagne glasses paused in the air. The string quartet continued playing in the far corner, suddenly the only sound in the room, the music floating over 300 people who had all, at the same moment, decided to stop talking. Because they knew him. Not all of them knew the details. Not all of them knew the structure of what he ran or the full geography of his reach. But in a room full of people who lived inside the world of global finance and private capital, the name Taejoon Park occupied a specific kind of silence. The silence reserved for forces of nature. The silence that precedes a weather event. He moved through their world like a current moves through water, invisibly, structurally, in ways that reorganized everything it touched. The whispers began at the edges of the room, where people were far enough from him to feel safe speaking. That's Taejoon Park, asterisk. Park Hyungnam, the one who owns, asterisk. His group took a position in Hayes Capital 6 months ago, asterisk. 40%, asterisk. He never comes to these things, why is he, asterisk. Look where he's standing, asterisk. The whispers moved inward, tightening, until the whole room was leaning slightly toward the center of it, toward the two people standing by the cocktail table near the windows, the woman in the emerald gown and the man in the black suit who had crossed a ballroom full of power and chosen, without explanation, to stand beside her. Armani felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes and did not move. Taejoon did not move either. He simply stood beside her, her hand held lightly in his, and let the room absorb what it was seeing. Then, slowly, unhurried, he turned his head toward Sterling Hayes. Sterling had not moved since Taejoon began crossing the room. His champagne glass was still raised at the same angle, frozen there, his smile locked in the expression it had been wearing when his name traveled across the crowd in a whisper and the color had drained, quietly and completely, out of his face. Taejoon looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke. Not loudly. He never spoke loudly. But in a room this quiet, a voice like his carried without effort. Sterling, asterisk, he said. Asterisk, I've been meaning to ask you something. Asterisk. He paused. The room waited. Your investment model, the one your company is built on. The one we invested in. Asterisk. Another pause. The kind that has weight. Walk me through how it works. Asterisk. 300 people exhaled without meaning to. Sterling's mouth opened. And Armani felt, for the first time in 3 years, something she had almost forgotten the feeling of. Not relief. Not satisfied. Something quieter than both, and more permanent. The particular piece of a person who has waited a very long time for the truth to find the right room. It had found one tonight. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment telling me where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going, asterisk Blackheart. Sterling recovered the way he always recovered, fast, surface level, and with a smile that had never once failed him in a room full of people who wanted to believe in him. Of course, he said, and the confidence in his voice was almost convincing. Almost. The model operates on a multivariable predictive framework, essentially a layered approach to market signal processing that accounts for macro volatility while maintaining position sensitivity at the asset level. He paused, letting the language land, watching faces for the familiar nod of people who did not quite understand but did not want to admit it. Taejoon's expression did not change. The signal processing, he said. Walk me through the architecture. Specifically how the model weights conflicting indicators during high volatility windows. A beat of silence. The weighting system, Sterling said, is calibrated through iterative adjustment. Essentially the model self-corrects based on incoming data streams and refines its output accordingly. Self-corrects how? Through a proprietary feedback mechanism built into the core framework. What kind of feedback mechanism? Sterling set his champagne glass down on the nearest table. A precise, deliberate gesture, the kind that looks composed but is actually a man buying himself 3 seconds. It's a layered system, he said. The specifics are proprietary, for obvious reasons, I'm sure you understand, given the competitive. I own 40% of your company, Taejoon said quietly. I am not a competitor. The room did not laugh. The room did not make any sound at all. It simply listened with the focused, collective attention of 300 people watching something unfold that they understood, at some cellular level, could not be stopped. Sterling's jaw tightened once. His eyes moved, briefly, involuntarily, to Armani. She looked back at him with perfect stillness. The model uses a proprietary neural architecture, Sterling tried again, trained on 15 years of cross-market data, with a dynamic reweighting protocol that. What was the training sample size for emerging market instruments? Silence. The sample was expanded during the second development phase to incorporate. What was the initial size? Not a question. A landing. Sterling looked at the man beside him, a senior member of his board, gray-haired, recently arrived, currently wearing an expression that had moved from polite interest to something considerably more attentive. I would need to check the specific figures, Sterling said carefully. The technical documentation would have the exact. You built this model, Taejoon said. Still calm. Still quiet. The words doing all their damage without any assistance from his tone. You have presented it to investors on 11 separate occasions in the past 18 months. You testified to its architecture before a capital oversight committee in March of last year. He paused. And you need to check the documentation to answer a foundational question about its training data. The sentence did not end as an accusation. It did not need to. It ended as an observation, and observations from a man like Taejoon Park in a room like this one had a half-life of approximately forever. Sterling's fiancée touched his arm once. He did not seem to feel it. The silence that followed was a specific kind, not the silence of a room waiting for something to happen, but the silence of a room in which something already has happened and everyone is simply catching up to it. Taejoon turned from Sterling without hurry and looked at Armani. Miss Carter, he said. The formality was deliberate and she understood it immediately. He was not being distant, he was being precise. He was placing her in the room correctly, the way a name on a deed places someone correctly in relation to a property. The predictive model currently operating under Sterling Hayes Capital, you're familiar with its architecture. It was not a question. They both knew it was not a question. I designed it, Armani said. Her voice came out steady and clear and she did not qualify it. Not I helped design it, not I was involved in its development. 3 years ago she had softened every sentence about her own work because the room always seemed to expect her to. She was done with that. I built it from the ground up over 14 months. The neural architecture, the training protocol, the weighting system, the feedback mechanism. All of it. She felt the shift in the room's attention. The subtle redistribution of weight, the way 300 people recalibrated who in this story they were watching. Would you show us, Taejoon said, how it works? Someone had set up a presentation screen near the eastern wall earlier that evening, for a scheduled financial outlook segment that was supposed to begin at 9 o'clock. The laptop on the adjacent table had not been touched. Armani walked to it without waiting to be invited, because she had stopped waiting to be invited to spaces she already owned. She pulled up the interface with the efficiency of someone returning to a room they know by heart. The model is built on a 5-layer neural network, she said, her voice carrying easily through the silence. The first layer isolates raw market signals across 17 instrument classes. The second applies a temporal weighting algorithm I developed specifically to account for the way volatility behaves differently in contracting versus expanding liquidity environments, which is the problem with most predictive models. They treat volatility as uniform. It isn't. She pulled up the architecture diagram. The screen behind her filled with clean structural lines, decision trees, weighted nodes. The third and fourth layers handle cross-signal correlation and conflict resolution. The conflict resolution protocol, the one Sterling described as a proprietary feedback mechanism, is a Bayesian inference structure I wrote over 6 weeks and revised 43 times. I have the version history. I have the original annotated code. I have 14 months of development logs timestamped and backed up across 3 separate systems. A board member near the front of the room leaned forward. Can you demonstrate a live output? She was already typing. She ran the model against a set of current market parameters, the kind of casual, fluid execution that only comes from years of intimate familiarity with a system. The output populated in 11 seconds. She walked them through it, what the model had flagged, why, how the weighting had resolved 2 conflicting signals in the high volatility window, what the confidence interval meant and why it was calibrated the way it was. She spoke for 7 minutes. Not one person in the room looked at Sterling Hayes. When she finished, the board member who had leaned forward sat back slowly in his chair with an expression that had passed through surprise and come out the other side as something heavier. Beside him, 2 other board members were already speaking to each other in low, urgent voices. Armani stepped back from the screen. Taejoon had not moved from his position at the center of the room. He had watched the entire demonstration with the same unreadable expression, but when Armani looked at him, something in the set of his eyes was different. Not surprise. He had not expected to be surprised. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, briefly, like the specific satisfaction of a person whose conclusions have been confirmed beyond any remaining doubt. He turned back to the room. In February of this year, Taejoon said, my investment group finalized a 40% acquisition stake in Hayes Capital. The decision was based primarily on the strength of the predictive model the company presented as its core proprietary asset. He paused. Before finalizing the acquisition, we conducted 6 months of technical due diligence. The gray-haired board member's head came up sharply. That due diligence included full forensic analysis of the model's development history. Version logs, code authorship records, internal communications, and the original intellectual property filing. Sterling moved. For the first time since Taejoon had spoken his name across the ballroom, he actually moved, a step forward, one hand raised, the performance reassembling itself around a new script. I think there's some context that's being. The IP filing, Taejoon continued, without altering his pace or his volume, lists a single primary author. The development logs confirm a single primary author. The original code repository was created under a single account. He looked at Sterling with the steady patience of a man who has had this conversation fully prepared for weeks. None of those records contain your name. The step Sterling had taken seemed to cost him something. He did not take another one. Additionally, Taejoon said, Miss Carter's original employment contract, signed at the founding of the company, contains a contingent equity clause. 15%. Activated upon any liquidity event exceeding the defined threshold. He let that sit in the air for a moment. Our acquisition qualified. The board member stood up. Sterling. His voice had dropped into the register that senior men use when the situation has moved past the point where tone matters. We need to speak. Tonight. 2 of the investors who had been laughing at Sterling's joke 40 minutes ago were now looking at each other with the careful expressions of people quietly calculating their own exposure. Sterling's fiancée had taken a small but visible step to her left, just enough space to suggest she was no longer certain which side of this room she wanted to be on. Sterling stood at the center of it all and said nothing. He had run out of language. That was the thing about a man who had built a career on borrowed brilliance. The moment the borrowed material was reclaimed, there was nothing underneath it. No architecture. No foundation. Just the shape of a building with no interior. He looked at Armani. She met his eyes and held them for exactly long enough to make clear she was not angry. Anger would have meant he still had the power to move her. What she felt was something cooler and more final. The clean, close feeling of an account that has been fully settled. She looked away first, but not because she had to. Because she was finished. The unraveling was not loud. That was the thing about a room full of powerful people. They did not make scenes, they made decisions, and the decisions moved fast and quietly like water finding the lowest point of a floor. Within 20 minutes, the board members had relocated to a private room off the main hall. 2 of them had made calls before the door closed. Sterling had followed them, not because he was leading, but because he had nowhere else to go. His fiancée remained in the ballroom for another 10 minutes, champagne untouched, before slipping out through the side entrance without saying goodbye to anyone. The investors who remained in the ballroom spoke in clusters, low, careful, the recalibrating language of people repositioning themselves for what came next. The name Armani Carter moved through those conversations the way a correct answer moves through a room that has just realized it had the wrong one. A woman from a mid-size institutional fund touched Armani's arm near the windows. "I'd like to have a conversation," she said. "This week, if you're available." Before Armani could respond, a man from across the room caught her eye and lifted his chin, the understated acknowledgement of someone who intended to be in that conversation too. She took out her card case and held it ready. Taejoon found her near the windows when the room had thinned to half its original occupancy. He came to stand beside her without announcement, the way he had done everything that evening, without performance, without asking whether the space was available, because he had already determined that it was. "You had the version logs with you," he said. "I brought them on a drive," Armani said. "In my bag. I've been carrying them to events for 2 years. Just in case." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city below. "The investment division of Hayes Capital," he said. "Currently it has no credible leadership. My group will need to restructure it before any of the current positions can be responsibly managed." He turned to look at her. "I would like you to run it." Armani looked at him. "Not at the offer." She had already processed the offer in the 2 seconds it took him to finish the sentence, already understood its dimensions and its logic and what it would mean. She was looking at him. At the steadiness in his face. At the fact that he had crossed a ballroom full of the most powerful people in the city and taken her hand without asking for anything in return, before any of this had happened, before she had demonstrated a single thing. "You already knew," she said. "Before tonight. You knew I'd built it." "Yes." "Then why the gala? Why do it here, in front of all of them?" He considered the question with the same unhurried attention he appeared to give everything. "Because he humiliated you in front of them," he said simply. "It needed to be corrected in front of them." Armani was quiet for a long moment. Below the windows, the city moved in its usual way, indifferent, continuous, full of its own business. In the private room down the hall, a board was dismantling a reputation. In the ballroom behind her, her name was being spoken by people who had looked through her an hour ago. She had walked in here alone. She thought about what that had felt like on the stairs, the breath, the deliberate descent, the decision not to rush. She was glad she hadn't. "I'll need full operational authority over the division," she said. "No reporting structure that lets anyone who is loyal to Sterling slow-walk my decisions." "Agreed. And I want the equity clause executed in writing before I sign anything." "It already has been," he said. "My legal team filed the activation notice this afternoon." She looked at him again. "You were very sure I'd say yes." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close to one. "I was sure," he said, "that you would know it was the right move." Armani looked out at the city for one more moment. Then she turned from the window and faced the room, her 15%, her model, her name now moving correctly through the mouths of people who finally understood what it was worth. She had walked into the gala alone. She would not be leaving that way. Subscribe to see what happens next, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Blackheart.